So with respect to the executive, in our system, obviously the president is indirectly elected, as much as we like to talk about the direct elections. It's not, as we all know, because of the Electoral College. And in fact, we don't really know which way the Electoral College is going to go officially, because they're supposed to. There's a sort of underwritten rule that they're supposed to vote the way the population votes, but in reality, they can vote any way they want. The idea behind the Electoral College was that we don't know what the hell we're doing, and so given that, there's been three times in history when the popular vote was ignored. So the Electoral College might be considered by some to hinder our democracy, but more on that in Poly 100. In terms of the president, well, the president in our system has usually been white and wealthy, and today he's not white, he's just wealthy. The president is the head of state and the head of government, so the president is symbolic, but he, so far it's been a he. I'll have to update this if Clinton wins. He or she, so I don't have to update this, manages the day-to-day affairs of the state. The president proposes legislation, can veto legislation. The president appoints judges. All this stuff you probably know. You should know. You do know. The president's the commander-in-chief. The president runs the cabinet. So what that means is the president is delegating authority to these other, what we call agents. Now, again, there are restrictions on the president. The president can be impeded by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can accept cases that make their way up through the system and then reject the policies that the president pursues. The remedy for the president is to have good lawyers and bide your time while you can, and implement your policies until they make it to that level, unless they're stayed for some reason. The president can also be impeded by Congress. The president can be imposed by members of his or her own party whose constituents have different preferences than do those of the president. So remember, we're talking about a different sort of electoral system, in a sense. These are direct elections for congressional leaders versus, or congressional members versus indirect elections for the president. So that's one thing. And then who do they represent? There's a national... it's a big difference to represent the national population versus a sort of niche population in your own state or in your own district. And then finally, the president can be impeded by a lot of things, but the president can also be impeded by his or her own civil service. People engage in foot dragging, reinterpreting broad orders, all these sorts of things. So slow down the policy process. If you don't like it, slow it down. So a remedy for this is to delegate secretaries, assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries, etc. But this delegation process, really at the end of the day, the president doesn't have control over most of what goes on. And finally, and I know I've worked backwards, we get to the legislature. In our case, it's called the Congress. This is, in theory, the dominant branch. The key here is that Congress holds the purse strings. Congress has to approve the president's budget. And these purse strings are essential to implementation of the laws. You need money to implement these things. So the Senate also ratifies treaties and executive appointments, for example, to the Supreme Court. Various secretaries, so cabinet officials, have to be ratified by the Senate. Congress can create legislation. They can end legislation by rejecting it. They can remove the president. And they can do this through impeachment hearings. They can also overturn the Supreme Court in presidential decisions. So all this stuff you probably know. In terms of the House, we're talking about 435 members who serve 2-year terms. The Senate is 100 members who serve 6-year terms. So both of these are elected through SMD plurality systems, and we've talked a lot about the electoral systems. But basically, what this means is that the voting districts are adjusted by the state legislature every 10 years, so that leads to the possibility of gerrymandering, because the state legislatures, unlike in the British case, are not independent bodies, but they are obviously political bodies composed of political elites. So what does all this mean for us, SMD plurality? Well, we've got a quite low voter turnout. In the best of cases, usually average about 50 to 60% during presidential elections. In 2008, we had 62%, which was a near record high. In 2012, it was 57.5%, which sort of highlights the disenchantment of a second term president more generally. But during the off years, we're talking, in other words, when there's not a presidential election going on, we're talking about between 40 and 50% voter turnout. That's pretty bad. That's the lowest level in the advanced democracies. Interestingly, it's also tied with the Swiss case. So this might represent voter fatigue or symbolize voter fatigue. You've got lots of levels and branches and election cycles. You vote for everything from the president to the Board of Education. I got a friend running for the Board of Education, by the way, if any of you are registered Berkeley voters. You've got judges that you have to vote for. And so all these things are they really make us tired. We don't want to dig into this stuff and find out who these guys are. And another problem, and there are plenty of problems, but another big problem which separates us from many other advanced democracies, or most other advanced democracies, is that we vote on a weekday. Everybody else votes on a weekend. So it makes voting much more complicated. And there's consistently an initiative in Congress that never passes to change that to weekend voting. And this is a relic of something long ago. It was something like you can't vote on the Sabbath, right, which is Sunday, and then it took a day to get to the voting booth and a day to get back. So that rules out Saturday and Monday. So Tuesday works, and then there's Market Day, which I think was Friday, and so I guess Tuesday and Wednesday worked. But then Thursday you could vote, and then you'd have to get back by Friday, so that wouldn't work. So anyway, I guess Tuesday and Wednesday worked. You can look this up, but it was something archaic like that. Or so that's where we stand. Going back to this, some problems with our system. We've got a system where really you've got enormous campaign spending, lots of sound bites, in part thanks to this SMD plurality system. People try to organize voters. There's an effort to organize voters that is more costly because you're talking about an all or none situation versus in a PR system where you're going to get some representatives anyway if you have a strong enough voice. So this means that campaign spending is very high here, which brings us to the third point, which is that we've talked about this third parties are very much disadvantaged in our system, SMD plurality systems. There was an uprising of sorts in 1992. Ross Perot got 18.9% of the popular vote, but this was nowhere close to victory. Nader's gotten much less, and he's been trying since the 1960s. Usually the discussion of Nader or Perot or someone akin to them is much more about them taking votes from others than it is them actually having a chance of winning. So people say, well, should I vote for them? Well, then my candidate, the more viable candidate that I would otherwise support, isn't going to make it. So you could think about how this might look a little bit different in an SMD majority system, and we'll talk about the French case in a few minutes. Why don't you just think about that, and we'll talk about the French case in a moment. And I'll start another slide, or set a slide.